Someone said to me the other day, what made you want to write a book about a subject that was so dry and potentially boring? And I didn't quite have the wit to say, you're wrong. It's actually a moist and potentially erotic subject, or very provocative subject. That's one of those esprit d'escalier replies that only comes a few seconds later. But I don't think of language as dry and boring in the very least. So I'll get the statistics out of the way first, because the statistics precede the book, justify the book. The statistics are that there are about 6,000 languages spoken in the world now. And of those 6,000, perhaps 3,000, half of them, may be extinct by the end of the century. And only about 600 of them are thought to be absolutely secure. In other words, 100 years from now, there may only be 1/10 of the languages that are now spoken in the world that are still spoken on a daily basis. Many of the others will survive in the form of chants and songs and elders speaking to each other and middle-aged people who struggle to remember words, that kind of thing. But in terms of actual flourishing languages, we stand to lose 90% of all the languages now spoken in the world. I thought that was an amazing statistic, but more important, I thought it could provoke amazing stories. And that's really what my book is. It's a bunch of stories. And for this, I make no apology whatsoever. What I wanted to do was explore the psychology, the ethics, the aesthetics, all kinds of things that arise from language loss, that arise from the threat to languages. Why should it matter if everyone can speak English, and all of us here tonight, I assume, can speak English? Why should it matter if all the rest of the world speaks English too? Maybe that would be a good thing. And I give, I guess, many different answers to that, and perhaps it takes me 320 pages to really answer that question. And first of all, I guess I would say I'm not against bilingualism. I'm not saying to someone who grows up speaking Mohawk or Inuktitut that they should only speak Mohawk or Inuktitut, that they should not speak English as well. I'm not saying that. But I was talking a few years ago when I was embarking on the project. I talked to a friend of mine who's an engineer, a very practical guy. Grew up in Norway and became an engineer with Noranda. And he looked a bit skeptical and said, well, so what? You know, it's very good for business if everyone speaks English. Why would it matter? And thinking unusually fast on my feet, I said, aren't you from those islands off the west coast of Norway where there's an old form of Norwegian that's beginning to die out? And he admitted that he was. And then I said, well, how would you feel if that language, that culture disappeared completely? And he said, oh, that'd be a tragedy, that'd be terrible. And that was how I got his attention. That was how I got him to understand. Very often people can't quite see the point of Hopi or Navajo or Provençal carrying on, but if they happen to be Lithuanian, they certainly want Lithuanian to carry on, if that's the language of their parents or grandparents. So on a very personal level, a lot of people have an interest in their own ethnicity surviving, and that's sometimes how they begin to see the importance of everyone else's ethnicity carrying on. There are also practical answers. I mention at one point in the book that there's a language spoken by a very few people, a few dozen people probably now, in British Columbia called Halkomelem. And in Halkomelem, the word for what we call wild ginger literally means a device for the heart. Perhaps that plant has medicinal uses that scientists haven't yet discovered. We know there are all sorts of kinds of indigenous knowledge that survive among people in forests, mountainous areas, whatever, around the world. Often their knowledge of the environment is embedded in their language. If their language goes, all kinds of useful to us knowledge will disappear as well. But I'm a little suspicious of arguing too strongly from that, for the same reason that, you know, biologists might have a hard time explaining why the Vancouver Island marmot or the Banff Springs snail should survive, because you can't necessarily find a use for the Banff Springs snail or the Vancouver Island marmot. Either you get the importance of diversity or else, some level, you don't. But the best kind of overarching answer, the best kind of wide, broad answer in the book, I think, is not in my mouth. It's from someone I met in Oklahoma, who's a Harvard-trained lawyer, who also runs something called the Oklahoma Native Languages Center. Oklahoma is a state where there are about 30 indigenous languages, of which only 3 are being learned by children. So all the others not being spoken by any kids anymore. So I asked this guy, whose name is Greg Bigler, I asked Greg why it matters that he wants to preserve Oklahoma's languages. And what he said is this: it's a gift that we were given, and I'd hate to see us lose it. I don't think you can quantify it in terms of dollars or knowledge. It's just like saying, why do we care about art and music? Why do we care about our children? It's part of us. If we lost all of the literature that was written before 1900, it wouldn't stop us eating or breathing, but there would be some intangible loss that could never be recovered. Which I agree with. So, I'm going to finish by reading a short chapter that sums up better than anything I've said yet what this book is about, the different kinds of voices, different kinds of words that are in it. And although I did a lot of traveling for the book, I went to Australia and the Arctic and Provence and Oklahoma, this chapter is about a language that's spoken in a place I never did go to. Well, you'll hear. It's called The Verbs of Borrow. And scattered through the chapter, there are actually words from a book that I think express concepts that we just don't have in English at all. So these keep popping up. Ansre, to keep apart from an enemy or a wicked company. Mochrob, to express anger by a sidelong glance. Zum, to wear or put on clothing for the upper part of the body. I was feeling low. I'd spent the day wading through academic books about language, and my head hurt. It appeared more and more unlikely that I would ever grasp the phonetic meaning of a lengthened, front unrounded, half-open, laxed voice vocoid, or a voiceless laminal post-alveolar stop with slight aspiration and a high-off glide. Linguistics has a scholarly code that excludes the uninitiated, and it had begun to seem to me that the more you love languages, the harder this code is to learn. Returning to the crowded stacks of the university library, I began, almost at random, to pull books off the shelves. I didn't know exactly what I wanted. Instinctively, perhaps, I was searching for some proof of humanity among those dust-dry grammars and theoretical speculations. I was looking, I suppose, for a book that would lift a language off the page. The first candidate I found was A Practical Introduction to Tonga, published in London in 1953. Forget the South Pacific. Tonga, in this case, refers to a language spoken in what's now Zambia and was then called Northern Rhodesia. The author, C.R. Hopgood, aimed his book not at scholars or students, and still less at the Tonga-speaking people themselves, but at junior officers of the British Empire. He was determined to school them in grief. Hopgood's first lesson begins with the words, Bantu Bafwa, the people have died. Just as a digression, I have to say this, I'm not kidding, I am not making this up. This is a language book where the very first phrase is, the people have died. And it proceeds to the Tonga phrases for, the thing is dead, the small object is dead, and the ferocious animals are dead. Lesson 2 starts off with, get up, you little beast, and lurches ahead to, the animals bite. By lesson 4, the syntax has become more complex. The baboon is eating up all of the people's food. And the mood is growing ever darker. Buntu bwangu bwamana. My humanity is finished. Lesson 7 bears a modest resemblance to the book of Job. My goat has aborted. His sheep were attacked by wild dogs. My sheep's hut has fallen into disrepair. All these mishaps lead up to the dignified distress of wild boars have sadly depleted our crops. Were upper lips ever quite as stiff as that? The Empire finds it hard to restore order. In the end, Hopgood can offer nothing more sanguine than a Tonga version of, It is bad not to hoe. Such neglect of agriculture brings troubles. It results in poor stamina. I abandoned the stresses of farming life in the Zambezi Valley and returned to the stacks. Eventually, I found myself glancing through a volume published at Gauhati University in the Indian state of Assam in 1977, a descriptive analysis of the Boro language, B-O-R-O. Which language was that again? I didn't know, and at first I hardly cared. What caught my attention was that Pramod Chandra Bhattacharya had dedicated the book to the memory of his son Amiya Kumar, dead at the age of 12, a boy who is no more in this world. Dr. Bhattacharya had researched and written the volume, he said, against a number of personal and national calamities which occurred during 1952 to 1964, some years before the calamity of his son's death. Humble to a fault, he offered his apologies for my poor expressions, not only in Boro, but in English. I took the book back to my table and sat down with it. Egthu, to create a pinching sensation in the armpit. Khale, to feel partly bitter. Khanse, to pick an object up with care as it is rare or scarce. Boro, I learned, is a language of northeastern India that spills over into neighboring countries, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh. Most of its speakers live on the north bank of the Brahmaputra River. The language goes by other names too, Mech, Kachari, and now the most common, Bodo. Whatever name you choose, it's one of well over 200 languages in the fertile subfamily of Tibeto-Burman. Nearly all these languages, being indigenous to a small area, have never had great numbers on their side. Boro is one of the very few that may be spoken by as many as 1 million people. Its speakers are usually fluent in Bengali, or in Dr. Bhattacharya's mother tongue, Assamese. Bilingualism is doubtless an asset on an individual level, but for a language with as little clout as Boro, it can also be a prelude to permanent silence. No nation, state, or province uses Boro as an official language. Bigger languages are muscling into its territory. Many of its speakers suffer wretched poverty. Most of its linguistic relatives are even smaller and more obscure. Yet Boro has its partisans. The desire to sustain it stands at the root of a political movement that now strives to create a new Indian state of Bodoland, or in the movement's most extreme form, a sovereign, fully independent nation. Despite being the sons of the soil, one Boro leader protested in the Indian parliament, we people have been neglected, discriminated, oppressed, suppressed, and misruled ever since independence. A few days after my chance discovery in the library, I surfed the internet and came across an interview with Yuji Brahma, president of the All Bodo Students' Union, who complained that under the pressure of aggressive syncretization, several Bodo subgroups have forsaken the language and culture. This poses serious threat to the survival of our Bodo culture as a separate entity. As I knew from living in Quebec, nationalist movements often draw their most potent energy from fears of language loss and cultural erasure. To make a quasi-mathematical formula out of the idea, you could say that any advance of the global is likely to produce a defense of the local. Advocates of Boro who found the students and politicians too mild-mannered have formed a guerrilla army, the Bodo Liberation Tigers. In the past few years, the most violent or desperate among the separatists have begun to massacre Hindi and Bengali-speaking migrants settling in their homeland. Unlike many endangered languages, Boro does exist in written form. Indeed, 2 written forms, the Roman alphabet of the West and the Devanagari script of India. Feuds between their partisans seem to have consumed more time and anger than the common struggle against outside enemies. This too is a tale with precedents. Gobram, to shout in one's sleep. Gulan, to bend after overthrowing or uprooting. To dig soil as the swine do, or to move curry while cooking. Looking at these verbs, rolling them around in my mouth, I was reminded of the first time it ever dawned on me that languages could not be translated on an exact word-for-word basis. As a boy, I took private French lessons from a chain-smoking spinster cousin of Albert Schweitzer, who had somehow fetched up in a basement apartment in Lethbridge, Alberta. One day, I tried to say, "I'm hungry." French, however, demands not an adjective, hungry, but an abstract noun, j'ai faim, I have hunger. Likewise, I have thirst, I have fear, I have 9 years. You can't just reproduce the English parts of speech. You have to recreate the idea. You have to search, often gropingly, for the best possible equivalent. For a unilingual child like me, this was a radical, scary notion. When you venture outside the confines of a mother tongue, you have to embrace uncertainty. And yet English and French are related languages with a long overlapping history and a mountain of shared vocabulary? How much harder is the search? How much rarer is a precise equivalent when two languages have little in common? The verbs of borrow challenge me, not with déjà vu, but with jamais vu. It's not only a language of verbs, of course. Under the discrete fluorescent lights of the library ceiling, a few nouns also stood out on Dr. Bhattacharya's crinkled yellowing pages. Bakhali, a woman who carries a child on her back. Gansuthi, the first grown feather of a bird's wing. Zugno, the sound produced by a mixing of mud and water if you thrust your hand into a crab's hole. How could anyone resist a language whose expression for slightly humpbacked is gob-dub-dub? Borrow has a whole range of terms for calling out to animals. Ducks, pigeons, poultry, cows, buffalo, pigs, cats, puppies, and grown-up dogs all demand words of their own. In contrast to English, which asks its speakers to say ah, oh, and hey in a variety of moods, Borrow is blessed with 20 interjectional exclamative particles to express everything from insult to affection, terror to sympathy. And it also has a folk song in which the singer comforts a young bride with the reassuring information, ants prepare their food store with the help of their saliva. Unless I have severely misread Dr. Bhattacharya, though, the glory of the language lies elsewhere. Ongaboy, to love from the heart. Onse, to pretend to love. Onsra, to love for the last time. Verbs like these go beyond all borders. The ideas or sentiments they express transcend the culture that articulates them. I can't imagine I will ever need to express the noise that mud and water would make if I refused to let a sleeping crab lie. As far as I'm concerned, zogno is a word that can happily stay in Borrow. While I love the surprising verb dasa, it means not to place a fishing instrument. I accept with some reluctance that my own language might have little use for it. But onse and onsra are a different story. It's to pretend to love and to love for the last time. Having met those words in Dr. Bhattacharya's book, how can I do without them? I covet them, just as I covet the verbs for expressing anger by a sidelong glance or for feeling partly bitter. They are more than just fresh sounds on the tongue. They are fresh thoughts in the mind. Poring for the second time over Dr. Bhattacharya's painstaking text, I recalled a passage by the lawyer Rupert Ross, whose book Returning to the Teachings explores some of the vexed encounters between Cree and Ojibwa people in northwestern Ontario and the forces of the Canadian justice system. Ross says that those encounters are made trickier by the distinct worldviews that underlie the speakers' languages. And he says, my Aboriginal friends talk a great deal about what it's like to have to use English all day, and they generally describe it as a strain. If we truly recognize that we occupy a universe of constantly transforming things, people, and relationships, then we would have no choice but to discard our heavy reliance on nouns to capture and describe it. Yet that reliance is woven deep into the fabric of English. Nothing could be more difficult to discard. Is Borrow a language like Cree and Ojibwa, in which the world appears to be constantly transforming? Dr. Bhattacharya reports that if Onsra is said in a different tone, it has a different meaning, to arouse the female oracle for the last time. A susu, to feel unknown and uneasy in a new place. Gabhran, to be afraid of witnessing an adventure. Serom, to examine by slight pressing. It's possible, I admit, that some of these words have simple English equivalents that Dr. Bhattacharya failed to find. I'm somewhat dubious about his explanation of kholab, to feel tedious for an odd smell. And while I accept his faith that a Borrow proverb effectively means an honest person is troubled, I'm still puzzling over his literal translation. The cat clears its bowels on mild soil. Amid the movable curries of the Brahmaputra, bowels seem to be a preoccupation. Where English offers a tedious feeling sentence like, a great man behaves honorably, Borrow conjures up a smell. A big man farts straight behind. Still, you might retort, especially if you happen to be an admirer of Noam Chomsky, the two phrases mean the same thing. As a non-linguist, by the way, I realize how incredibly audacious, not to say goddamn stupid I am by daring to take on Noam Chomsky in a couple of chapters, but on the theory that fools rush in where angels fear to tread, here goes. In aspects of the theory of syntax, Chomsky wrote, it is possible to convey any conceptual content in any language. An extraterrestrial, he once suggested, would see all human beings as speaking a single language. We earthlings may be forgiven for choosing a variant perspective. As the critic George Steiner once noted, Chomsky's ideas could account with beautiful economy and depth for a world in which all people would be speaking one language, diversified at most by a moderate range of dialects. In fact, however, the luxuriant profusion of tongues on the planet challenges any simple notion of evolutionary benefit to our species, and the incredible diversity of human languages is just as remarkable as the hidden similarities of their grammar. Besides, there's more to any language than just its ability to express conceptual content. Languages, said Ken Hale, a colleague of Chomsky at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, languages embody the intellectual wealth of the people that speak them. Losing any one of them is like dropping a bomb on the Louvre. Gagrom, to search for a thing below water by trampling. Goblo, to be fat as a child or infant. Gobre, to fall in a well unknowingly. A quarter century after Dr. Bhattacharya's descriptive analysis was published, linguists are again at work on Boro. Unlike the imperial Hopgood among the Tonga, they're carrying out their labors on behalf of the local people, but their motives are zealous. They think they have God on their side. On an American website, I found news of the language's speakers under one of their other names. As in most animistic cultures, the Metch live in fear of the spirits of nature. Only through appeasement can they have peace or success in life, but no one is sure when or if the spirits are appeased. The Metch need liberation from such oppressive beliefs. As a result, they're now featured in a series called Unreached People's Prayer Profiles. After a quick sketch of traditional Boro culture, the website requests a few prayers. Ask God to grant wisdom and favor to the mission agencies that are targeting the Metch. I think the verb targeting merits some thought there. Ask God to anoint the gospel as it goes forth via radio in their area. Ask God to speed the completion of the Jesus film and other Christian materials into the Boro language. My first instinct is to urge the Boro to use the missionaries Asusu and to answer them, keeping Onse in reserve for emergencies. Otherwise, the Boro may soon pass beyond Mukhrab to a destructive Khale. I really got worked up about that. Yet it's not that simple. The missionaries changed the culture, but the culture is changing anyway. Even rural Assam is subject to the forces of globalization, and the tribal peoples of northeastern India face a host of pressures, economic and environmental ones among them. As well as calling for prayer to save the oppressed souls, the missionary website warns that a large percentage of the people have encumbered unmanageable debt. By continuing to speak their language, the Boro won't get rid of their debts, nor save their forests, nor halt the influx of outside settlers. But they may be a good deal more likely to withstand the corrosive despair that accompanies these pressures, avoiding the self-hatred that comes when a culture implodes and disintegrates. J.R.R. Tolkien, a linguist before he was a novelist, once noted the part played by the cultivated Icelandic language, in spite of poverty, lack of power, and insignificant numbers, in keeping the Icelanders in being during desperate times. Pride in their own tongue could give the Boro, too, a better chance of survival. Who knows, the anointed gospel might even play a role in a drama of language preservation. Otherwise, chaos beckons. A hare dies, H-A-R-E, that is. A hare dies due to its shit. Boro sayings are not for the squeamish. A deer dies due to its footstep. A man dies due to his mouth. Bunhan bunahan, to be about to speak and about not to speak. Char, to smell like urine or raw fish. Chen, to hit one's heart.